Call. Piper Retold. A Tale in the Romance, a Medieval Fairytale series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. 1. Another one full, Sarah said, carefully tipping the contents of her apron into the sack. The peeled chestnuts cascaded dutifully down onto their fellows, before Sarah tied off the top of the sack, so she could carry it to the cart. The chestnut harvest had been good this year, and they'd have plenty of flour to see them through till spring. Once these had been milled, of course. How do you peel them so fast? Sylvana said, staring at her half-full basket. She stabbed her knife into a shell and the nut jumped out, surprising her. Practice and knowing which ones are ready and which need more time, Sarah answered. She seized her empty basket and headed up to the smokehouse. She breathed deeply as she ascended the stairs to the upper level, where the racks of sweet-smelling chestnuts dried over the smoke from their smoldering shells on the level below. It took her right back to her childhood, when her grandfather had first brought her in here. She'd had to stretch up onto her toes to see the rows of round nuts lined up on the racks, and the one that burst open before her eyes. She'd squealed at the glimpse of creamy gold flesh amid all that brown, and her grandfather had helped her peel the nut and take it home. If she'd known then that she'd inherit the smokehouse, along with all the rest of her family's holdings, when sickness had carried away her parents and all her siblings in one horrible summer, and she'd struggled through her first autumn harvest alone, she might have been less excited about that first visit. But grief no longer stabbed at her heart as it had all those years ago, and she'd spent every harvest since shelling nuts with Tola and Maria, Sylvana's mother, until one cold winter's night, when the reaper had called for Maria too. If only she had a daughter who would take her place at the table with Sylvana, and Tola's daughter Swanhild, when she was gone. Though the way fate had shaped her life so far, Sarah herself would probably teach Sylvana and Swanhild's daughters to shell the nuts, her fingers as gnarled as the chestnut kernels themselves. Sarah shook herself. Such thoughts were silly. She had no need of a daughter, she had a fine son. Tobias would be a man soon enough, ready to marry and have children of his own. If only his father had lived long enough to see him. Were those tears on her cheeks? Surely not. It was perspiration from the heat in here. She should fill her basket quickly and head back outside. By the time she reached the cooler air outside, Sylvana had emptied her basket, and was headed into the smokehouse for a refill. Can you teach me to choose the right ones? Both you and Tola work so much faster than me. I'll never be good enough. Sylvana's eyes brimmed with tears. Sarah pried the basket from the girl's hands. Your mother was always the slowest of the three of us when it came to peeling the nuts, but she was the best at pressing them. Here, take my basket and put them in the pressing barrel. I'll fill yours for you. Really? Sarah gave a nod, and the girl hastened back to the table where Tola still sat. The morning passed quickly, until the cart could hold no more. Sylvana might have spent more time stamping on the nuts in the pressing barrel than picking or peeling them, but Sarah didn't mind. She'd done her fair share of dancing in the pressing barrel when she was a girl. Now her feet would hurt by day's end if she did Sylvana's job. Will you join us for the midday meal? Sarah asked Sylvana. The girl shook her head, furrowing her brow. I'll take the cart down to father at the mill. I must make sure he has his dinner, she said. Sarah nodded. Regulo had not taken his wife's death well, and if he didn't have Sylvana still, he might have followed Maria into the grave. Best the girl get home and give him some work to do. So Sarah helped Sylvana harness the pony to take the cart to the mill, where Sylvana and her father would turn the shelled nuts into flour, to be bagged and distributed as Sarah directed. Her family might own the chestnut orchards and the smokehouse, along with all the land around, but Sarah made sure those who helped with the harvest received their share of the final product, to feed them through the winter. Even Sylvana and her father, who took a tithe of what went through the mill. Her family had once owned the mill too, but some wise ancestor had bequeathed the orchards to one brother and the mill to another, which made Sylvana and her father some sort of distant cousin to Sarah, several times removed. "What's in the pot?" Tola asked, bringing Sarah's thoughts back to her own home. Sarah grinned. "I hope you're not sick of chestnuts. I popped some in the pot, along with the peas I shelled this morning and the last of the bacon. It should have thickened nicely by now. Perfect with some bread." Tola's eyebrows rose. "You're out of bacon already?" "Tobias eats enough for 3 men, though he's still a boy. He'll have to do without for a few weeks. As soon as we've cleared the smokehouse, Cronus will slaughter some pigs for me and hang them up to smoke. They're fattening up in the forest on fallen chestnuts as we speak. Whereas Swanhild eats like a bird. I'd fear for her health if she didn't spend most days in the forest harvesting herbs. There's food aplenty for those that know how to find it, and she must." Tola shook her head, then sniffed deeply. "Oh, it is definitely time to eat." They took their bowls outside to the table where they'd been shelling nuts, sitting in the last of the sun before the mountain shadows stole it from them. But until it did, they enjoyed the view over the lake that lay beside the town. Today, the still surface mirrored the blue sky, illustrating perfectly why the town had earned its name of Miroton. "Mercurio is early," Tola remarked. Sarah sopped up the last of her stew with a crust of bread. "He's not due for weeks and it looks too big to be his boat, are you sure?" Tola pointed, and Sarah could not deny that the ship cutting its way across the lake bore Mercurio's brightly colored sail. "Profits must be good if he has bought a bigger boat." Both women rose. "I'd best get home and see what I have to trade. He'll have some rare ingredients from the traders in Rialto which I've been waiting for," Tola said. They said their farewells while Sarah gathered up the dishes, but Sarah lingered outside for a moment. Mercurio the merchant, sailing his boat up and down the river and through the mysterious marshes to the port of Rialto, always brought new and intriguing things from faraway lands. For a price, of course. What treasures would his ship hold this time? A chill breeze swept down from the mountain as the sun slipped behind a cloud. Sarah shivered and hurried inside. 2. Run, girl, run. Zoticus watched the girl's expression change from panic to determined clarity. Her arms flew out like wings, letting go of everything she possessed. Before her things thudded to the ground, Melisande took flight. He'd seen the sequence a dozen times in his visions of this moment, but somehow the addition of sound made it more real. The scrunch of sand beneath her boots as she broke into a run, audible even over the distant screams of battle on the other side of the field. Clad in only her tunic and hose, Melisande moved so swiftly the cloth was plastered against the curves of her blatantly female body. Eager shouts and the thunder of hooves heralded her pursuit, invisible in the crowd of panicked crusaders. Zoticus unslung his bow and reached for his first arrow. He sighted along it, then waited. 4 riders emerged from the melee, whipping their horses hard in their frenzy for the hunt. The hunters did not know they would be the prey today. Sir Engerant led the charge, a black raven atop a stolen white horse. Sir Giscard followed some distance behind, his horse unable to keep up with the fleet-footed mare. Sir Onfoy was hot on his heels, with Sir Roland bringing up the rear on a horse that could scarcely bear his weight. Zoticus could not abide a man who abused his mount. He lined up his shot, and Roland fell first, rolling on the ground while his relieved horse rode on without him. Onfoy had chosen to wear armor today, so Zoticus had to choose his target. Ah, there it was. When Onfoy leaned forward over his horse's neck, his breastplate rode up, exposing far more of his side than was safe with archers about. A kidney shot, followed by a second arrow that lodged firmly in the man's left buttock. He too went tumbling from the saddle, but unlike Roland, Onfoy's foot caught in the stirrup, and his horse dragged him along the ground, likely doing even more damage. Giscard had not bothered to don his armor, so the owl on his tunic was clear to see. Zoticus aimed for above the owl though, and his aim was true. The first arrow caught him in the back of the neck, sinking in deep. Enguerrand rode alone, heedless of the loss of his companions, intent only on catching the girl. A girl whose head whipped back for scarcely a moment. Had she seen the glint of the knight's teeth, bared in a triumphant grin? Or was it her brother's horse that had made her smile before a puff of magic surrounded her, and she vanished? Magic spirited her across the field and into the trees, faster than any horse could gallop, but Enguerrand could not see it. Instead, he reined in his horse, casting about for the treasure he'd lost. Only then did he realize he was alone, his men having fallen along the way. In the space of a moment, Enguerrand seemed to regain his senses, and he fixed his sights on Zoticus. With the girl gone, he set his horse against a different target. Zoticus stood his ground. He'd seen this in his vision too, and he knew how it would end. He waited until he could see the horse's eyes, mad at this mistreatment from a man who was not her master. "Now! Halt, Pegasus!" Zoticus called, and the obedient mare skidded to a stop. But Enguerrand did not, flying over the horse's head and over Zoticus, to land awkwardly on the stony ground. The knight struggled to draw his sword, but he'd broken both arms in his fall. "Help me and my father will richly reward you," the man begged. Zoticus leaned down and pulled Enguerrand's sword from its scabbard. It was a fine weapon, far finer than the man it had been made for. The knight would need neither sword nor scabbard now, so Zoticus unfastened the man's baldric. More broken bones moved beneath his hand. Enguerrand had shattered several ribs too, and at least one had punctured his lungs. "Mercy!" cried the knight. He tried to lift his arm to shield himself, but his strength had already started to fade. Zoticus considered the shattered man at his feet. Mercy came in many forms. A magical healer might make the knight whole again, but without swift aid he would certainly die, and die in agony. "Did you offer Babette mercy? Or any of the other girls you hunted and killed like animals?" Zoticus asked, sliding the sword back into its scabbard before tucking both into his bag. "Who?" the knight asked. "Did you know any of the girls' names?" "No." "How about Sir Joss, who you cut down with this very blade, so that you might force yourself upon his sister?" Zoticus persisted. He'd heard of men who repented their crimes when faced with death, but he had yet to meet one. Most of the men Zoticus had killed preferred to spit curses with their final breath. It seemed Enguerrand would not be such a man either. "Help!" the knight moaned, trying to crawl away. Zoticus decided to leave Enguerrand until last, and check on the others. Guiscard stared sightlessly up at the sky, a broken arrow protruding from his throat. It had gone all the way through, as if shot from a crossbow and not a longbow. A formidable weapon indeed, no wonder the Seljuk archers were so fearsome, armed with these. Zoticus would keep his Seljuk longbow, lest it be useful later. Onfoi's corpse was not so serene. His horse had grown weary of dragging it, and crushed the offending weight beneath his hooves. The result was that where the knight's head had once been was now a piece of pulped meat. Roland had not been as lucky. Thrown free from his horse, his roll along the ground had torn the arrows out of his flesh, leaving gaping wounds through which his organs spilled. Much like Enguerrand, Roland's injuries were definitely mortal. 4 men dead, or they would be by the end of the day. And every man who'd marched with them, thanks to the Seljuk army and the ambush, no one but Zoticus had suspected. He could head home and collect payment for a job well done. But he owed it to Joss to bring proof to the man's grave that his sister's violators were no more. So Zoticus collected 3 more swords and 3 signet rings, before heading back to the moaning, groaning worm that was Enguerrand. He found Pegasus prancing around the man, shaking her head at him. It wasn't until Zoticus got closer, that he realized the wretch had managed to wrap his hand around a rope trailing from the mare's bridle, and she was attempting to break free. "Easy, Pegasus," he said, holding up his hands. He'd seen Godfrey manage this horse all the way to Bizzes, and she'd seemed a biddable enough beast then. Now, if you'll just let me get close enough, I'll free you, and we can be on our way. I'll take you home to Godfrey and all your other stablemates, Zoticus continued. This was apparently not to Pegasus's taste, for she reared up onto her hind legs, then brought her front hooves down hard. Enguerrand's brains splattered on Zoticus's boots. Pegasus tossed her head, pulling the reins from Enguerrand's slackened grasp as she stepped back from the corpse she'd created. Zoticus pulled the ornate raven ring from Enguerrand's hand and stuffed that into his sack with everything else. Now, would you like me to take you home, or are you planning on joining the Seljuk army? He asked the horse. It was a good thing horses were not susceptible to the plague, or she never would have made it home, Zoticus thought. Nor had she liked the ship, but... He blinked. A low wooden ceiling floated above, while straw rustled beneath him when he moved. Everything ached like Pegasus had stomped on his whole body. But he'd returned Pegasus to Godfrey long ago, before placing his sword and signet ring collection on Joss's grave. In fact, the last time he'd felt so weak, he'd been aboard that rat-infested ship, fighting off that benighted plague that had killed off more crusaders than the Seljuks had. Zoticus groaned. Not again. A pestilence on all plagues, for he was heartily sick of them. 3. When Tobias left to take the goats up to the high pasture the next morning, Mercurio's stall was already under construction. Not that Mercurio himself was doing the work, oh no, he had every laborer in town fetching and carrying for him, earning credit they might spend on his goods. Sarah's brother-in-law Ahab would be among them, likely setting up the stall and directing everyone else, for it would not do for the head of the town council to be seen doing the work of a common laborer. She shaded her eyes and peered at the hive of activity on the lake shore. Ah good, Mercurio had brought the winter fodder for the town. They'd had a warm, dry summer up in the mountains, but you could never tell if the lowlands had had similarly good haymaking weather, until the hay arrived. In her grandfather's time, the hay they made in the high pastures had seen the village livestock through most winters, but the goat herd had grown since then, even more so with Ahab on the council. He'd helped the town prosper, and it had surely grown, so they could sell their surplus downriver, but they'd also had to buy in more things they simply didn't have. Without trade, Miroton would face a hard winter. But not this winter. Judging by the parade of bundles coming out of the ship's hold, the hayst beside the town green would be full to the rafters. A good thing, for the harvest from the high pastures had barely filled her own hayloft this year. Part of her wanted to go down there and see what Mercurio had to sell, but she still had chestnuts to shell, so she fetched a basket and sat down at the table where she might watch the impromptu market while she worked. Mercurio's first customer was Tola, carrying 2 big baskets of herbs to sell. They took their time, bargaining over each item until Tola looked satisfied. Only then did Tola deign to look at Mercurio's wares, carefully selecting perhaps half a basket's worth of things before any coins changed hands. Sarah smiled. No wonder Mercurio appeared to be sweating. Tola was the one taking the money, not him. Most people didn't know she'd grown up in Rialto before coming to Miroton, newly widowed, and she'd learned to bargain from the best. The next customer was Ahab and his daughter Isabel. Sarah was surprised to see the girl, for when she'd asked Ahab if Isabel could help shell nuts, he'd said she was too ill to leave the house. If she'd recovered, Sarah should ask again. She set down her basket and headed down the hill to the lake. On her way she met Father Fazio, the town priest, carrying a large cloth-draped bundle. "Are you selling things to Mercurio too, Father?" Sarah asked. Fazio laughed. "No, Mistress Sarah. All I have belongs to Mother Church, what would I have to sell? But Mercurio carries goods and messages from my bishop in Rialto, and he is kind enough to transport our messenger birds back." He lifted the cloth to reveal a cage full of pigeons. Sarah blinked. "I thought the point of messenger birds was that they could fly and carry messages on their own." Wouldn't that be faster than sending them by boat? Fazio's eyes widened before he laughed again. Oh yes, of course, but messenger birds only fly home. You cannot train them to fly back and forth, wherever you please. So these birds are Mirotan pigeons born and raised here. Mercurio will take them to the bishop, who can then send me messages by releasing these pigeons. Ingenious, no? Sarah had to agree. Before she could say so, however, little Bernard ran up to the priest to breathlessly ask for him to come and help his grandfather. Fazio promised to speak to Sarah more later, and headed off with the boy. Mistress Sarah, you grow more beautiful with each season that passes. She arched her eyebrows. And your flattery, Master Mercurio, rings even more hollow than last time. He looked hurt. Mayhap you cannot see it, but I only speak the truth. Come, Ahab, is Sarah not the most beautiful woman alive? Beautiful but heartless, I fear. I have asked her many a time to marry me, but she still mourns my brother and will until her dying breath, Ahab replied. At least that's what she'd told Ahab. Heartless indeed, Mercurio said smoothly. Any other town along the mighty river I might find a guest bed in the best house, but Mistress Sarah would rather I sleep aboard my cold boat than beneath her roof. His eyes glittered, daring her to defend herself. But to do so, she'd have to admit she'd taken Mercurio as her lover, after her husband had died, and he'd likely be her lover still if she hadn't seen him with a maiden in one of the other villages downriver. Well, the girl had been a maiden until she'd succumbed to the trader's flattery. Sarah had no intention of lying with a man who had a mistress in every hamlet he docked at. I think only of the virtue of the girls in our town. Your reputation as a seducer of women precedes you, as always, Mercurio. Sarah smiled sweetly. Ahab's eyes grew huge. Come, Isabel, we should get started on those mattresses. Even with straw this fresh, they will not stuff themselves. He tugged on his daughter's arm to hurry her back up the hill to town. Sarah almost laughed. Ahab had his shortcomings, but he was absolutely devoted to the protection of his only daughter. Speaking of which, Isabel, I still have chestnuts left to shell. If you have time to help, I can promise you a bag of chestnut flour for the trouble, Sarah said. Isabel turned. I thank you for the offer, Aunt Sarah, but I must do the mattresses. Maybe when they are finished. Sarah nodded. The offer is open until all the nuts are done. At least another week. Isabel nodded her thanks, then hurried off in her father's wake. What do you have to trade, Mistress Sarah? I have much that might interest you. Fine silks from across the sea, candles from the Holy Land you might burn in church to pray for your husband's soul. In fact, I have been fortunate enough to acquire an entire cargo of items from the Holy Land and Bizzers. If you ever chose to wear anything but mourning clothes, you might like. Mercurio flung open a chest, then lifted up a swathe of gossamer thin fabric that shimmered in the sunlight. The sunlight seemed to shine right through the bright stripes too. The finest silk from the Far East. You would look divine draped in a dress made of this. I'd look like a concubine from someone's harem more like, Sarah said. She shook her head. Maybe next time you come to Mirotan, Mercurio. The miller has barely begun grinding this year's crop of chestnuts, so I cannot say if we will have any surplus to sell this year. It will still be another week before I'm done shelling them, the harvest was so good. After that, I'd hope to start on the cheeses, though I'm down a dairy hand since Santina died. No one else can work that kind of magic with milk. Sadly, Santina had not managed to teach her cheese-making skills to her daughter Isabel. They'd both fallen ill of the same summer fever, and only young Isabel had survived, though she'd been delicate ever since. Mercurio pressed both hands to his chest. Arg, but you are heartless indeed, Mistress Sarah. Not only do you deny me your warm hospitality, but I do not even have one of your glorious cheeses to sweeten my supper. Her cheeses were salty, not sweet at all, but Sarah chose not to correct him. Instead, she said, perhaps you should try to sell some of your holy candles or other things to Father Fazio, who has some pigeons for you. Perhaps next time you will feel more kindly disposed toward me, Mistress Sarah, Mercurio said. She couldn't suppress her smile. Perhaps. It will depend on how good a price you give me for my cheeses. Mercurio bowed deeply. Mistress Sarah, I have always given you my best, and I always will. No. No matter how good a lover he'd been, she had no intention of allowing him to share her bed again. See you next time, Mercurio. She turned on her heel and headed back up the hill. 4. Peace, brother. I mean you no harm. Zoticus blinked, his bleary eyes focusing on the blade he held at the stranger's throat. The religious brother's throat, judging by the man's tonsured head. Zoticus sheathed his knife. Forgive me, brother. What with your dark robes and all, I mistook you for death, come to claim me. The monk managed a sad smile. I suspect death fears you more than you fear him, for he took everyone else in the village, yet you are still here. You mean the plague killed them? The monk bowed his head. They no longer suffer, yet by some miracle you have been saved. I must take you to see the abbot. Zoticus considered arguing, but this abbot would likely know more than some lowly monk. May I have a moment to make myself presentable then? He asked instead. The monk smiled. Of course. Take all the time you need. I must see if there are any other survivors in the inn. Zoticus chose not to extinguish the hope in the man's eyes with more truth. Now if he were traveling with Melisande still, the crusader girl with a magical gift for swiftness, he would have made some wry remark that would make the girl's eyes grow round, the better to drink in all the strange sights as they traveled. But she was a girl no longer, traveling only occasionally with her husband, for they had several children now. And her brother, the brave but foolish Sir Godfrey, it did not do to dwell on the past. Particularly when in the present, he needed to take a piss. That taken care of, he found a fresh tunic and hose, but what he really wanted was a wash. Heaven only knew how many days he'd lain abed, fighting the plague. Something to ask the abbot. What little water remaining in the ewer did not look fresh, so he headed out to the inn yard in search of a well. He found a horse trough, the water murkier than the bottom of the jug in his room, and shuddered. The well, when he did find it, was tucked behind the stables, beside the inn's kitchen gardens. Even in the warmth of a summer afternoon, the water felt shockingly cold against his skin. The vision hit him without warning. The bite of cold air on his cheeks, as a woman dashed across a castle bailey, her heavy cloak flying out behind her like a raven's wings. Her ruddy lips parted as if to speak, urgency darkening her eyes. Zoticus blinked, and the vision was gone. He knew neither the woman nor her castle, but one day he would stand in that very bailey, witness to the lady's flight. That's how his visions worked. Several minutes later, washed and dressed in clean garb, he strode out into the town square. Monks carried cloth-wrapped bundles to a cart, before heading back into the cottages where the townspeople had once lived. A small arm slipped from its wrapping, and Zoticus's blood ran cold. The bundles were all bodies, being taken to the churchyard for burial. You should not be here, good sir, if you value your life. Please, I beg you, turn back the way you have come, lest this accursed pestilence take you too. Zoticus spun to face a panicked priest, who seemed to think making shooing motions with his hands would make Zoticus disappear. Death didn't want me. One of the monks woke me. I was sleeping in that inn over there. Zoticus pointed. The priest's eyes widened. He fell to his knees, lifting his face to the sky. Heavens be praised. A miracle, just as the abbot predicted. He fastened his hands on Zoticus's arm. Sir, you must accompany us back to the cloister of the Holy Innocents. God himself has saved you, as the abbot saw in his vision, and you must come. Zoticus gently pried his arm free. You're mistaken, father. There's nothing holy or miraculous about me. Just a matter of luck is all. Luck and magic, but he didn't think this pious priest would want to hear that. This isn't the first plague I've caught. I went on a crusade once and our whole ship got sick on the way home. Death doesn't like me is all. Twice saved from the plague. You must be a holy man indeed, sir. I beg you. A flash of color caught Zoticus's eye, and he ignored the priest so he might cross the square to see what it was. One of the bodies had been wrapped in a brightly striped cloak, the sort he'd seen sold in the marketplace in Bizes. The sort crusaders had bought as gifts to take home for sisters, wives and daughters who would never receive them. Melisande had bought a sack made of the striped stuff, and he'd teased her mercilessly about it. She'd stubbornly hung onto it until the day of his vision, when those 4 dishonored knights had died by his hand. But the cloak, crusaders had bought every one in the marketplace, until there was no striped cloth left in the whole city. And those who had survived to head home had fallen at the last in the plague ships, their belongings stored in the holds of those doomed vessels. Ships Zoticus had told Duke Sebastiano to burn, with everything they contained. Surely the man hadn't been foolish enough to take the infected goods and offer them for sale. But the Duke was a merchant of Rialto. Commerce ran as readily as blood through the veins of a man of Rialto. Zoticus should have burned the ships with his own hands. Doused them in oil, then thrown a torch in after. But surely the plague could not persist for more than a decade. He might not be as skilled a healer as his mother or Melisande, but he knew enough about his family's history to be sure. Later, when he was alone, he would sift through the magical memories of his ancestors, to see what else they knew of plagues that might tell him how this could happen. Yet the cloak wrapped around yet another plague victim shone bright with accusation. He needed to know how a dead crusader's cloak came to be here of all places, at the same time as a plague slaughtered the town. "Will you come to the cloister?" the priest asked. His eyes shone with a kind of fervent faith Zoticus could only envy, for he had never known such a feeling to dwell within his own breast. "It is a most holy place, with relics from the holy innocents preserved beneath the altar. I have no doubt it is God's call that woke you from your deathly sleep, calling you to undertake a pilgrimage, sir, to thank God for the miracle of your deliverance." Zoticus blinked. Once again he found himself unwilling to destroy another man's hope. "Perhaps, father. But first I must head for Rialto. I have pressing business there which cannot wait." 5. When the pony had finished his breakfast, Sarah hitched him up to the cart. She'd loaded the last bag of peeled chestnuts last night, and it was time to see whether Regulo had finished milling the previous load. In better times the answer would have been yes, and he'd have delivered the freshly milled chestnut flour already, but he wasn't the man he'd once been. Perhaps he never would be. So she walked alongside the plodding pony and cart, as an excuse to see how Regulo and Silvana fared. "Good morning, Mistress Sarah. You're up early." She blinked. Father Fazio looked far too cheerful for such an early hour. Then again, she'd rarely seen him anything less than eager to please. "My son rises with the sun, and if I am not by the door when he departs, he's likely to forget to take his dinner, and it's a long day in the high pastures for a hungry boy," she said. He nodded and smiled. "I'm sure my mother thought the same of me. Now I am a man grown, it makes little difference. It is not my mother who seeks to feed me, but most of the mothers in the town, convinced a priest living on his own cannot possibly cook for himself." He laughed. "They do not believe there were no women in the seminary, and that we were all required to learn to cook. Even if I hadn't, still they give me too much. But that is perhaps a good thing, as then I have surplus to give to the families who need more than they have." He went on to name names. Sarah only nodded. Between herself and the priest, they saw to it that everyone in town had enough to see them through the winter, and none of the names were news to her. Then she realized he carried another cloth-draped bundle, much smaller than the one he'd had before. "Are you bringing breakfast to someone in need, Father?" she asked. He shook his head. "Oh no, my messenger pigeons would make a poor meal. Especially this one, which only arrived this morning." "And what news did he bring from, your bishop, I believe?" Sarah asked. She could tell from the slump of his shoulders that it couldn't have been good. "He sent word of a cursed plague, wiping out the port town of Altino. Not a single man, woman or child was spared," Fazio said, his eyes wide. Her heart constricted in her chest. She knew what it meant to lose loved ones to sickness. To lose an entire town. Oh, that is terrible. All those poor people. The bishop cautioned us to remain true to our faith and not be tempted to wickedness, lest the same fate befall us. Sarah made a rude noise. It wasn't anywhere near as impolite as what she'd say to Fazio's obnoxious bishop, "Were he here." While some of the people of Altino might have been less than virtuous, I cannot believe even the children deserved such a fate. Plagues do not come out of nowhere, and they are spread by people. Yet there are cases in Scripture that tell us such things have happened in the past. Towns where there was not one good man. I know my Scripture too, Father, and while there may not have been one good man in a particular town, I'm certain there were plenty of good women or at least children. Yet the Bible is mysteriously silent about those. Father Fazio seemed nervous at the turn their conversation had taken. Perhaps he feared for his soul. "You are mistaken, Mistress Sarah. The Holy Gospel of St. Matthew clearly tells us that Herod slayed the holy innocents at the time of our Saviour's birth. They are surely saints in heaven, along with all the other martyrs who have given their lives to the Holy Church. Perhaps you should come to the church to pray to those saints so that they may strengthen your faith in this dark time." So it wasn't his soul he feared for, but hers. Perhaps he was right to do so. Perhaps. If only there was less work to do. She might spare a moment to light a candle once this delivery was done. "Will you be heading back to the church soon, Father? Perhaps you might say a prayer for me, and a mass for those poor souls who died in Altino." He shook his head. "I must bring this pigeon to Mercurio, so he can take it back to the bishop. I pray he has not left yet." The priest hurried off toward the lake. Sarah shrugged and continued on to the mill. She might not have hours to spare on her knees in church, but she could and did pray that Mirutin might be safe from the plague that had afflicted Altino. For it was only a short sail down the river, a thought which sent a cold shiver down her spine. Please don't let Mirutin suffer the same fate as Altino. 6. Rialto had grown since Zoticus had seen it last, as the swampy city always seemed to do. And yet it grew ever more beautiful as the years passed. He knew plenty of women who would wish to know the city's secret, for their beauty only faded as they gained wisdom. But if the Duke of Rialto had sold plague goods, then Rialto had descended into the depths of stupidity. No one would buy their trade goods if they were known to be tainted. Surely Sebastiano could not be so senseless. Unless age had stolen his wits. At the ducal palace he gave his name to a servant, and declined the offer of refreshment, for Duke Sebastiano would not keep him waiting. Sure enough, Zoticus spotted the servant returning. "His Grace the Duke has no business with you and he will not see you," the servant said. "The Duke jests surely." The servant shook his head. "The Duke does not jest. Duke Sebastiano enjoys a joke as much as I do, I am certain. Take me to him and you shall see." The servant stared. Duke Sebastiano had been dead these last 5 years. "We have a new duke now." A cold hand wrapped around Zoticus's heart. Another good man gone. Would he outlive everyone before death came to claim him? Zoticus inclined his head. "Then I thank you. I shall visit Palazzo Ziano instead. I imagine Domenico is head of the family now?" But the servant was already hurrying away. Zoticus hid his smile. So they did know who he was. Never mind that Zoticus had never killed a man who didn't deserve it. Loyal servants were a rare enough breed. Without killing them alongside their wayward masters, somehow, his fearsome reputation always preceded him and made men quake in their boots. He hoped Sebastiano's sons were as well informed as the new duke's servants, or this could be a very tedious trip. When his boat drew up outside Palazzo Ziano, Zoticus could not help but notice the old water-stained wooden doors had been replaced by shiny new ones clad in bronze. Business had prospered for Sebastiano's family, which didn't explain why they'd felt the need to deal in death. He found two of the sons at home, ensconced in the dining room where he'd shared food and wine with their father. Unlike the new duke, Domenico and Orso were quick to invite him to join them. Pleased to see that Ziani hospitality had not died with their father, Zoticus was only too happy to take a seat at the table. "So did Pietro find you?" Domenico asked, gesturing for a servant to refill Zoticus's wine cup. "I don't think so," Zoticus said, taking a bite of his fish pie. "No one did seafood quite like the cooks of Rialto. I was taken ill on the road, and when I recovered, I came straight here from Altino." "Then you must have seen him. He sent a messenger with a chest full of coin from Altino over a week ago, saying he had some final trade negotiations to tie up before he came home." It seemed death-like to fondle Zoticus's heart lately, for he felt that cold touch again. There is no one left in Altino. A plague struck down everyone in the town, leaving nothing but corpses and ghosts. The only people I saw were some monks burying the dead, and insisting he visit their abbot at his mountain sanctuary, up to and including giving him detailed directions and a map. Memory niggled, and he paled. It would not surprise me if the monks succumbed to the plague too. I hope your brother's trade negotiations took him far from there. Or Pietro was likely to be dead too. Orso raised his cup. Knowing Pietro, he's probably counting his coins thrice to make sure he was paid properly. Even I can't believe father forgot about those ships, but Pietro found them and turned a pretty profit on them. Was it his imagination, or did the wine taste sour? It had seemed so sweet only a moment before. Zoticus set his cup down. "What ships? What cargo did they carry?" Domenico shrugged. "These were old ships. Father loaned them to the previous duke to carry a military force to Bizes or some such place, I believe, but the duke lost so many men he could not crew all the ships to sail them home, so they remained at Bizes. Shortly before father died, he sent for his ships, and he anchored them in the lee of one of the shoals at the far end of the lagoon. There they might have remained, had a storm not heaped so much sand on the shoal that it became an island. An island where the Benedictines wanted to build a monastery, but they couldn't, on account of the ships sitting in the sand. The Benedictines wanted to use the timber, for there was a quantity of good oak in those hulls, but the council would not let them, for they were Ziani ships." Orso laughed. "You know Pietro. He smelled gold, and he would hear no argument until he had seen those ships. He headed out into the lagoon that very afternoon, and before the day was done, he had an army of men ready to help him dig the ships out of the sand to refloat them, for they were still sound. And their holds were full of cargo that had been sitting there, safe in the sand. The food was spoiled, of course, mostly eaten by rats, and the rats had turned quite savage, with nothing to eat but one another, but he found chests full of cloth and weapons from Bizes. I claimed a chest of silks to send to my sister. She is companion to the queen in Aros now." "Ah yes. Godfrey's bride, Penelope. If you love your sister, you will burn that chest and everything it contains. I sailed on those ships when they came to Rialto, and plague carried away all those who sailed with me. I told your father to burn the ships, so the pestilence would not spread." Zoticus rose. "On the morrow I beg you will take me to these ships, so that I may set a torch to them myself." Domenico shook his head. "It is too late for that." Pietro and his men packed the cargo onto the 3 most seaworthy ships, and sold the remaining hulks to the Benedictines. He sold the cargo before he reached Altino, for he sent the coin home. The chests are in the strong room even now, waiting for Pietro to return and take it to our bankers. Pietro would not return. Zoticus knew it as surely as he knew more innocent people would die if he did not burn what remained of that cargo, and the ships carrying it. And it would be his fault. If Pietro or any of that cargo comes here, you keep it away from everyone else until I return. I'll buy everything from you, I swear, and I'll pay any fair price for it. If you place any value in the friendship I had with your father, with your family, you will let me do this, Zoticus said. Orso's eyes widened. I did not know the assassination trade was so profitable. It wasn't the profit so much as the number of commissions he'd taken in a long and successful career, coupled with how little he'd spent over the years. Years of bringing death to those who deserved it, for deeds even he did not want to speak of, and he would hand over every copper coin he'd ever earned to deny death an even bigger harvest at his hand. Zoticus wet his lips. I assure you I have gold enough to satisfy even you. Father's account books say that though the ships are his, the cargo aboard them belong to you. Pietro said he would search for you, while we kept your portion of the proceeds in our strong room. The coin is yours to do with as you please, including buy ships, if that is your wish. Rialto-built ships are the best merchant vessels afloat, and rarely sold to men who are not citizens of our fair city, but as father trusted you with our ships in the past, so will we in the future. Breath whooshed out of his lungs, relief though fleeting. There was still much to be done. Thank you. If you will tell me where Pietro went, and where he planned to go, perhaps that will speed up my search. Finding him would place us in your debt, Domenico said. Zoticus inclined his head. Consider it a favor, as a friend. Only if you sup with us tonight, and remain as a guest in our house until the morrow. In the morning we will furnish you with a boat and a crew, to help you with your search. Zoticus sat down. Gladly. If you do business so smoothly with everyone, I suspect you will soon be the richest merchants in Rialto, if you are not already. Orso winked. Perhaps. Zoticus settled in for a pleasant evening, smiling and laughing with the two men he hoped would never know how many times he'd been asked to dispose of members of their family, though he'd refused every time. The richer they became, the more enemies they created. Yes, the Ziani brothers had been partially responsible for the plague outbreak in Altino, but these two had not known the risks carried by that fateful cargo. Not like he or their father had. But with Sebastiano dead, the blame fell squarely on his shoulders. This time he swore he would save people instead of killing them. 7. By the time Tobias returned home that evening, Sarah had spoken to Tola and Goiko the apothecary, and she'd spent the rest of the day attempting to implement all the plague prevention measures she'd learned. Both his bed and hers were stuffed with fresh hay from the high pastures, mixed liberally with pennyroyal, lady's bedstraw and rosemary. Swanhild had brought her a basket of fresh sage, which they'd both hung in bunches from the rafters to dry. She'd bought every health-promoting herb, tea and potion they'd had on hand, urging both Tola and Goiko to make as many as they could, in preparation for a possible plague. Mercurio had left, so Regulo had his mill hands back at work again, and Silvana had promised to bring up a load of flour as soon as the cart was full. Biorma the brewer had sent over 3 casks of cider vinegar, and promised a dozen more when he'd finished brewing this season's crop of cider apples. A good thing too, for she'd used most of the first cask cleaning everything in the house, and now she could smell nothing but vinegar. What is that smell? Tobias asked, wrinkling his nose. He likely smelled of grass from the high pastures and the mountain air. Healthy air, free of sickness if Tola was to be believed. It is the smell of cleaning. A plague came to Altino and many people died. I cleaned the house because Tola said good hygiene helps to stop sickness. Sarah wrung her hands. She also said oranges and lemons would help, but she had not seen any since leaving Rialto. Father Fazio suggested all we need to do is pray to stay safe, but surely that is not enough, or someone in Altino might have been saved. You must go only to the high pastures and come straight home at night too, for the fewer people you see, the less chance you can catch the plague. Oh, I should ask Ahab to call a special council meeting, so we can discuss how we shall protect the town. There is no plague here, Mother, and perhaps it is not so bad in Altino. They're all the way down the river by the sea. You've told me yourself that sometimes stories can grow bigger in the telling than they ever were in life. He reached out and took her hands. By all that was holy, he was beginning to look like his father. It won't be that bad. You worry too much. She squeezed his hands, then let go. Perhaps I worry more than I should. But I'm your mother, it's what mothers do. And since I lost your father, you're all I have. If I lost you, I'm not sure what I would do. He grinned. Well, you're not going to lose me, so that's one thing you won't have to worry about. Soon I'll be a man, and I'll be able to take your place on the council, and you won't have to worry about that either. It was his uncle Ahab's place he would take on the council, not hers, but she didn't say that. Ahab had only joined the council after his brother's death, while she grieved his loss. When she'd surfaced from her grief and Tobias had been old enough for her to attend council meetings, she'd been grateful that Ahab had stayed. Tobias should start attending the meetings soon, so he'd get to know what happened. Soon. When the plague had passed. Just promise me you will keep yourself safe, stay away from anyone in town who appears ill, and spend as much time as possible in the clean mountain air, Sarah said. Tobias laughed. You forgot to remind me to watch out for the goats. She managed to smile. Well, yes. You've been goat-herd long enough, I thought you might have grasped that by now. It's been years since I lost one, and I still hold that the kid wasn't moving at all when the eagle carried it off. It might have been already dead. Yes, well. What's for supper? Poor Tobias, always hungry. I've been so busy cleaning today, I almost forgot to cook. Luckily, old Matteo caught more fish than he could eat out on the lake today, so I've made a fish stew and there's fresh bread. While she ate supper with her son, at least she didn't have to worry about him not eating enough. 2 helpings, and he looked like he was considering a third. 8. The raven-winged woman flew through Zoticus's dreams that night. The panic in her eyes set his heart racing as if he shared her fears. So it couldn't be him she feared, though she looked right at him. Something she was fleeing from, maybe. In the vision, Zoticus focused on what was behind her. A stone castle, yes, but it was built into the side of a hill. No, more like a mountain, for he could see snow-capped peaks towering into the distance behind the castle. Not here then. His vision would not happen today. Zoticus blew out a breath. None of his visions had ever affected him so much before. He'd long since learned that they were glimpses of a future he could not change, and they only grew clearer as the event he'd seen approached. So why did this one feel so urgent? Perhaps she was a possible plague victim he had to save. But pestilence was not something she could run from, and he was not some noble knight or someone who could work miracles. Except his own recovery from the plague, which was no miracle, no matter what that monk had believed. He rose, wishing for just a moment that he could spend every night in a fine feather bed, like the Ziani family did. But the mattress alone would not fit into his traveling bags. He had 2 traveling bags, a sack that seemed to carry all his belongings, and a small rough pouch scarcely large enough to contain his midday meal, had it not been magically enhanced. He spread the pouch flat on his bed, where it looked like little more than a ragged circle 2 handspans across. An empty circle, which yet contained enough gold to buy Sebastiano's ships, weapons and clothing to let him travel comfortably anywhere in the world, and an assortment of other magical objects that had come in useful on more than one occasion. Moreover, most of them could only be used by someone who had his blood. Well, more accurately, his mother's blood, for she was the powerful enchantress who had enchanted all his things, but because she was his mother, her blood ran through his veins and allowed him to use the items as though he possessed a measure of his sister's or his mother's magic. He was nowhere near as powerful as either of them, of course. Zoraida had single-handedly fought a dragon, but it gave him an edge and kept him alive. He stretched his hand out over the splayed pouch, thinking about what he would need for his quest. His quest to find the plague ships and the goods they contained, and perhaps Pietro too. He'd need a light cloak, yet something tightly woven enough to keep the weather off, and keep him warm at night. The corner of a striped biz's cloak appeared in his hand. Zoticus laughed softly. He'd forgotten he had it, a gift given to him by Godfrey, who'd complained that Zoticus wore too much grey. He still wasn't sure if Godfrey had known he was an assassin. Then again, this quest was about saving lives, not taking them, so perhaps he should wear another color than grey. When he burned the ships and their cargo, he would wear the silly striped cloak. But in the meantime he'd need another cloak, some more clothes, his healing amulet. When he'd packed all the necessary items into his traveling sack and made himself look presentable for the day, he tied the pouch to his belt again and headed down to break his fast. He found Domenico and Orso already in the dining chamber. Once more he wondered if he was mistaken. Had they knowingly sold tainted goods for a bit of extra gold? Or was this all a matter of Pietro's greed, which he had likely already paid the price for? "I hope you find him and succeed in finding those ships," said Domenico, almost as if he shared his sister's talent for reading minds. Zoticus did not need such a talent, he knew truth from lies, and Domenico meant every word. Zoticus relaxed. If the Ziani brothers had been responsible for spreading the plague, he would have been honor-bound to return and exact justice from them. As it was, he strongly suspected he would never see these men again. He ate a few bites before bidding them both thanks and farewell. Domenico walked down to the dock with him, pressing a sizable sack of supplies into his hands for the journey. Zoticus boarded the small sailing boat, exchanging nods with the two men who crewed her, and with a push of a pole, they were out in the middle of the canal, and Zoticus's quest had truly begun. He only prayed it would come to a satisfactory end. 9. It looked like most of the town had turned up for the council meeting. Even Tobias was there, though he was hiding in the back with Raphael, the apothecary's apprentice, as if he didn't want her to see him. But she hadn't the heart to send him home, no matter how much she feared for his safety. He deserved to hear all they knew about the plague, and what the council planned to do about it. If he had questions or even suggestions, she'd see that they were heard. She might not sit in the place of honor that belonged to Ahab, but even from her end of the high table she would be heard if she chose to speak up. Not that she'd need to. The people of Miroton were a sensible lot, most of the time. Ahab called for quiet, and the chattering crowd obeyed. He cleared his throat, then said, "I've called you all here to hear some grave news Father Fazio has received from his bishop. It's best that Father Fazio tell you himself." The priest seated at Ahab's right hand rose. "The port of Altino has been afflicted with plague." A low murmur rose from the crowd, though not loud enough to drown out Fazio's words as he filled in what details he had. None that Sarah did not already know, so she let her gaze drift over the crowd. Tola wasn't there, and nor were some of the frailer members of the town. Most of the children were in bed by now, so there were few young people present, except for Tobias and Raphael, who'd been joined by Swanhild and Silvana. "What happens if it comes here too?" Sarah couldn't see who had spoken, but it did not matter. Everyone looked worried. "What shall we do?" was the cry on everyone's lips as they turned to each other in panic. Sarah found herself rising to her feet, her hands out to placate them all. "We are quite a way upriver from Altino, so if we stay here and avoid contact with anyone who has been to the tainted town, we should be safe. We are well provisioned for the winter, and there is much left to harvest before the first snows fall. If we forego all trade with towns closer to the coast, we will all see next summer safely. Meanwhile, if you find yourself ill, speak to Tola or Goiko, who know many remedies that will soon see you back in good health. There is nothing to worry about." She tucked her skirts beneath her and sat down. In the silence that followed, she found the townsfolk nodding, looking relieved. She might not be a leader like Ahab or even her late husband, but the people trusted her to do what was right. Of course there is nothing to worry about. Altino was a den of wickedness, full of sailors and infidels and thieves. Miroton is a beacon of virtue, compared to the likes of them. But we cannot forego trade. What Mistress Sarah forgets is that we only have winter fodder because Mercurio brought it on his boat, not even a week ago. And the herbs and medicines Tola and Goiko sell? Also bought from Mercurio. Trade is the lifeblood of our town, and we cannot stop it, any more than we can stop our own hearts from beating without committing a mortal sin. What does your bishop advise us to do, so that we do not share the same fate as Altino?" Ahab boomed. Fazio didn't even glance at Sarah. "The bishop commands us to stay on the true path. To lead virtuous lives, so we do not invite God's wrath upon us. We should pray and never close our doors to those who might seek our assistance or hospitality. Because as his most holy Son said in the Gospels, whoever welcomes the least of his flock welcomes the Lord himself into their home." Sarah bowed her head. She'd offer charity to any member of Miroton, rich or poor, but to a stranger who might carry the plague and kill them all? Did God really require that of her? Ahab pounded on the table. "And there you have it. We cannot close off our town to the outside world. God himself forbids it. We will pray and we shall trade, and we shall stand out as a beacon of virtue in the mountains that will shine out to the very sea itself, so that other towns between us and Altino will know how to save themselves too." No. That couldn't be right. Sarah opened her mouth to say so. Someone let out a cheer, and soon the whole hall was filled with happily cheering townsfolk. Any words that might have left Sarah's lips were drowned out by their preemptive cries of triumph. A hand landed heavily on her shoulder. Sarah jumped out of her seat, only to find Ahab behind her. "Next time stay silent and you will not look so foolish," he said gently. "You know little about what it takes to run a town, and as a woman, your soft heart will lead you astray. Remember, Adam would be safe in Eden had Eve not tempted him with the apple, after she had surrendered to temptation. You only have a place on this council out of respect to your father. If you lose the respect of the townspeople through further foolishness, you will lose your seat on the council too. Leave leadership to your betters." Another pat, and he left. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut. She would not let them see her cry. She wouldn't. Yes, she'd been foolish to speak first. She should have waited and then spoken her piece. That it had taken Ahab, the son of a goatherder, to point out what she should have seen by herself, rankled the most. Next time she would not make the same mistake. She would do everything in her power to save this town, and no amount of condescension would stop her. She would be better. Next time. 10. There. Do you see those 3 ships anchored in that cove? Can you get us closer? It had been years since he'd boarded one, but Zoticus would recognize those ships anywhere. You didn't forget the floating coffin that had very nearly been your final resting place. Viator, the owner of the small sailing boat, nodded. Then he turned to his nephew. "Fidelis, take us around the headland." Zoticus kept out of their way as the 2 men turned their boat away from Altino to enter the eastern cove instead. When the nearest ship was close enough he hailed it, "Ho the ship!" He tried several times but nothing moved on deck. The same with the second ship. And the third. "That isn't a Ziani vessel," Viator said, jerking his head at the third, smaller ship. That's a river trading boat. That's Mercurio's boat, Fidelis agreed. All three of them shouted for Mercurio, to no avail. The two sailors looked worried, so Zoticus volunteered, "I'll go aboard to see if there is anyone there. Or some clue to where they might have gone." He didn't dare give voice to what they were all thinking, that nothing but ghosts sailed these ships now. "I'll meet you on the shore over there." He pointed at a tiny beach. He stripped down to his tunic, then dived over the side. Though it was still summer, the water was colder than he would have liked. The brisk swim to Mercurio's boat kept him warm though, and the air did not chill his skin when he climbed aboard. A swift search soon revealed that the riverboat was empty. No goods worth trading and no dead bodies either. The other two ships were much the same, no more than a couple of empty water barrels between them. The ships, however, had dead rats floating in the bilge beneath the empty hold. Zoticus swore. Hard though it was to believe that these ships and cargo had carried the plague for years before spreading it to Altino, the evidence was right here before his eyes. But where was the third ship and all the cargo? Not to mention Pietro and the mysterious Mercurio. The answers, he hoped, lay in Altino, where they would sail next when he rejoined the fishing boat. Too late, he realized he should have asked them to keep their distance, lest the beach be tainted too. His only hope was to reach it before them, so that he might warn Viator to stay offshore. He dived into the water once more, stroking for the shore. He didn't stop until the sand crunched beneath his bare feet, and it was shallow enough for him to stand. He turned to see that by some trick of the weather, the wind had died down, and he'd beaten the becalmed boat to shore. "Stay there. The beach might be tainted. I'll swim to you once I'm done taking a closer look," Zoticus shouted. Viator nodded and said something to Fidelis. A moment later, Fidelis dropped the anchor. Zoticus let out a breath. They were safe. For it soon became apparent that this beach was far from it. Above the high tide line sat several torn sacks, their contents spilling out onto the sand, with more rat corpses half buried in the spoiled grain and flour. From here, Zoticus spied a track that led away from the water. His feet felt leaden as they led him along the track, which soon widened until two wagons could travel along it, side by side, as the wheel tracks showed they had done. Sand dunes and beach scrub gave way to fields of stubble, harvested within the last few weeks if Zoticus was not mistaken. Likely hay for winter fodder, though it was safe in someone's barn now. More rat bodies lay between the shorn tussocks, and an eagle eyed him suspiciously, before spreading her wings in an impressive mantle and resuming her meal of decayed rat. There were no dead birds in the field, Zoticus noticed. Perhaps they did not succumb to the plague as readily as rats and humans. He hoped so for the eagle's sake. He followed the road to the top of a rise and drew in a sharp breath. Altino lay spread out before him, beside the rippled river. Fishing boats lined up along the canals, but there was no sign of life. Not even a curl of smoke from someone's cookfire. Even the monks had gone. Monks who had given him directions to their monastery, and multiple invitations to visit. Zoticus still didn't understand their vehemence. Maybe the abbot had wanted to engage his services as an assassin, for he could not think of any other reason the man might need him, imagined miracles notwithstanding. Something to consider after this current quest was complete. He headed back to the boat, hoping his swim would be enough to wash any pestilence off his clothes and body. Just in case, he warned Viator and Fidelis to keep their distance from him until he'd washed properly and changed into clean garb. His wet tunic went over the side into the water, better to buy another one than risk infecting anyone else. He'd use his healing amulet on himself when darkness fell, to banish any hint of disease in his blood. But first he had to burn the ships. He strung his Seljuk longbow with care before slipping on the worn finger guard that no one would think to look twice at. Anyone who could not sense the spell on the old leather, anyway. Next he pulled 4 arrows from his quiver, each wrapped in a piece of cloth. The slosh of liquid told him none of them had broken yet, though they would soon. These particular hollow shafts were crafted to shatter on impact, showering the target in Greek fire, a substance so flammable the Church had declared it a mortal sin to use the stuff in battle. He risked excommunication by even possessing it, though he knew no pope would ever dare to do so. There were cardinals aplenty who would pay handsomely for an assassin to bring the pope's reign to an end. Even the Seljuk bow should not have been able to fire the heavy arrows across the water to the ships, but that was where the magic finger guard came in. When he wore it, his every shot would find its target, though it helped if he was a decent shot to start with. Magic could only do so much. He fired 2 arrows at each ship, far enough apart to spatter the decks in the oily fluid. A final pair of fire arrows finished the job, like orange shooting stars arcing across the water, before they kissed the Greek fire. Flames raced across the decks of both ships, lighting up the sky more brightly than the sunset in the west. A friendly night breeze blew the smoke away from their boat, so they sat down to watch the ship's final fate as they ate their evening meal. The burning deck of the first ship collapsed into the hold, taking the mast and reefed sails with it. This was more than the ship's hull could take, for it careened over on its side, revealing a hold that could easily have been mistaken for the gate to hell, before it slipped beneath the water. Sparks from the fire on the second ship set some of its ropes alight, freeing the sail. The night breeze caught the sail and the second boat heeled over too, still burning brightly until it too sank. That left only Mercurio's trading boat and themselves in the cove. Inevitably, their talk turned to the missing ship. It could be anywhere. Any of the port cities along the coast. That's a Rialto merchant galley, the best trading vessel in the world, Fidelis said. Viator's brow creased as he chewed thoughtfully on a piece of dried fish. Pietro said he would remain in Altino, to finalize a deal of some sort. Wherever it went, it left from here, likely before the plague took hold in the town. But before or after the harvest? Zoticus mused. After. Viator took a swig from the jug of wine, then set it down. Altino and all the coastal towns here send extra hay upriver to the mountain towns, to feed their animals through the winter. Mercurio spends all autumn making his way up and down the river, trading hay and dried fish for the bounty in the mountains. Goat cheeses so sweet you'd swear they were soaked in honey. Chestnut smoked bacon like nothing else you've ever tasted. And bags of the nuts themselves to roast upon the fire. Anything worth trading, Mercurio will find the value in it. He will know where your cargo is and maybe your missing ship too. If he's still alive and hasn't succumbed to the plague, Zoticus said, debating whether to stuff meat or cheese into his flatbread. He opted for both. His first satisfying bite told him he'd made the right decision. He looked up to find both men staring at him. What? Is this plague truly so deadly? Fidelis asked. Zoticus swallowed. He wished he could make light of things, but they deserved to know the risks they faced. All of the people in Altino are dead. If Pietro or Mercurio were there, it is likely they died too. I saw the town from the road that leads to the beach. No movement, no smoke, no life. This plague is like nothing else I have known. There is no cure, and everyone I know who has caught it died of it. Viator squinted at him. Except you. Master also said you were saved. Death did not want him. Not yet. But Zoticus dared not tell these men about his visions. Magic saved me. I have a magical amulet a witch gave me. It protects me. I am still afflicted by disease, like anyone else, but I will not die of it. Viator nodded. So it's both a blessing and a curse. A wise witch, whoever gave it to you. Zoticus laughed. She is my mother, and I thank you for the compliment. She is wiser than I will ever be. I'm sure she would find this missing ship and our men too. If Mercurio has it, then he has taken it upriver to trade. We could try following him tomorrow. Not before first light though, for the river has some treacherous shallows for those that don't know it, much like the shoals around Rialto. It's been years since I've been further inland than Altino, but I'll take you as far as I can, Viator said. It was as good a guess as any, so Zoticus agreed. It felt right, and he wasn't a man who ignored his intuition. And it took him into the mountains, where he might meet this woman who haunted his dreams. Yes, upriver they would go. 11. Towns and villages slipped by as they sailed upriver, each as silent and smokeless as Altino. More than once he'd caught Fidelis and Viator crossing themselves, murmuring prayers and muttering about ghosts. Even Zoticus had felt the spirits of the newly dead staring at him through the ether, all accusing him of coming too late. He'd gone ashore at the first 3 towns, before the stench of death had sickened him too much to do it again. The dead villagers might not be capable of answering his questions, but they told him enough. The plague had passed through their village and then swept on up the river, pushed by the sails of the 3rd cursed ship. It was enough to make him want to weep. So many innocent lives lost, because one greedy merchant had not burned the boats like he'd asked him. Because one careless assassin had left them with that merchant to report that he'd succeeded in killing more men. And he'd saved a horse. Stupid, foolish, the words he could have heaped on his own head for his folly would never be enough, for they could never restore the lives that had been lost. There it is, Fidelis breathed. Thank heaven for small mercies. The ship never reached Miroton, Viator said. What's Miroton? Zoticus asked. Viator pointed. A short sail further on there is a great lake. Miroton is the town on the lakeshore. The people earn their livelihood from the mountains. Many medicinal herbs are only found here, and the chestnut groves grow wonderfully well. And the cheeses, they say it's the mountain pastures making for finer milk than the lowlands, but my sister says there's old magic here. She should know. She's the town witch. There was pride in his voice at that. So once we've dealt with this ship, we can go into town and visit your sister? Zoticus suggested. Viator shook his head. She has not spoken to any of our family for many years. My father forced her to marry a man whose wickedness, if only I'd known. When he drank too much wine he beat her. One night he was so drunk he fell in a canal and drowned. She disappeared the same night. At first we thought her dead too, but some of her things were gone from the house. Things she would never leave behind. I searched for years until I heard a whisper about a new witch in Miroton. I sailed up here myself to see, and she threatened to turn me into a fish and cook me for dinner if I ever returned, or breathed a word to our father that she'd survived. She had a child too, a little girl who looked just like her. So no, I will not be welcome in Miroton, though you may have better luck. Zoticus nodded. He hadn't seen his sister in years either, though he knew she'd had children with her husband. She'd probably have set fire to her husband if he'd tried to beat her though. She'd fought a dragon once and lived, which was more than most men could say. Fidelis hailed the ship. After the river of death they'd sailed through, Zoticus would have been surprised to hear a response. Of course there wasn't one. Bring me as close as you can, then stand off a ways. I'll swim back, Zoticus said. Viator did as he asked, and Zoticus soon pulled himself over the gunwales of the missing ship. And swore. The hold was full with more casks stacked on deck. A lumpy pallet covered in a striped cloak took most of the leftover space, and the stench coming from it didn't bode well. Zoticus swallowed, then forced himself to step forward and snatch up the cloak. The corpse beneath it could not have been dead for more than a day, but the summer heat had not been kind. It wasn't Pietro, so he assumed it was Mercurio, the lost river trader. Pietro must have perished in Altino, like he'd originally thought. Fidelis shouted his name, and Zoticus moved to the side of the ship, where the others could see him. Have you found them? Zoticus wet his lips. We were too late. They're both dead. Not technically a lie, but he had no intention of letting the two fishermen aboard to see for themselves. We should return to Rialto, to tell Domenico and also that their brother is dead. What about my sister? Viator seemed surprised at his own outburst. If it was Zoraida, Zoticus wouldn't have hesitated to see for himself. But the plague posed little danger to him, while it could be deadly to Viator and his nephew. I'll go up to the town and see if she is well. Zoticus wasn't a praying man, but he was willing to pray for Viator's sister's health. How long will it take for me to reach the town? Half a mile along the shore, so not long at all. But if Tola is well, she will surely offer you hospitality you cannot refuse. It'll be days before she lets you leave, and only then because you fear you will be sick from eating so much. Viator laughed, but it sounded forced. If not, if she is ill, then I will do my best to heal her, Zoticus promised. At best, all he could do would be to ease her passing, but that was something at least. Go to Rialto. I will meet you there or send word if I cannot. Viator clasped his hands together and bowed. You do me a great service, Master Zoticus. If ever you have need of a fisherman or a boat, or anything at all, come to me in Rialto. I will leave your things on the riverbank, near the road to town. May God continue to preserve you. Preserves. That gave Zoticus an idea. He checked all the casks on deck until he found one that contained lamp oil. Not as effective as Greek fire, but it would still burn, and he could save the stronger stuff for another time. He splashed the oil across the deck, on the corpse, and as much of the cargo as he could reach. Noises from a cloth-draped bundle made him put the cask down and investigate further. Beneath the cloth was a cage of messenger pigeons, still alive. He'd seen plenty of dead people on the way here, but not a single dead bird. Perhaps the pigeons, like the eagle in Altino, truly were immune to the plague. He could not stand to burn the birds alive either, so he opened the cage and let them fly free. They all headed in the same direction, toward the lake. His next destination too. When he ran out of oil, Zoticus leaped over the side of the ship and into the water. The river current was slow here, so it was an easy swim to shore, where Viator had left his sack and his bow. Ah yes, he would send a fire arrow into this ship too, and stay until it sank into the river. Only then would this quest be over, so that he might start the new one to see to Viator's sister. 12. Walking into a town with living, breathing people was a surreal experience. He'd seen so much death in the last few days that life seemed too loud. Breathing in the smells of cooking and smoke without the miasma of death made Zoticus almost light-headed. Are you well, sir? He looked up to meet the eyes of a concerned man. A farm laborer, or Zoticus missed his guess. A commoner who could not tell the difference between a knight and an assassin, but sensed deference would serve him best. Zoticus wet his lips. I soon will be if you could direct me to a witch or herb woman if you have one in this town. The man's chest puffed out. Here in Miroton we have our own apothecary. You can't miss his house, there is the sign of the mortar and pestle over the door. Zoticus managed a thin smile. But I want to see the witch. Oh. The man shrugged, before some thought occurred to him that creased his face with suspicion. He squinted at Zoticus. I hope you don't mean to bring trouble to our town. Miroton looks after its own, and no mistake. But if it is truly our witch you want, you will find Mistress Tola's house 3 doors down from the apothecary. Zoticus thanked the man and continued down the road. Sure enough, he spotted the crudely carved bowl with a stick over the door of the apothecary, but he continued walking. He smelled the witch's house before he saw it, for she had bunches of herbs strung up to dry beneath the eaves of her cottage. Sage mostly, but there were rare mountain flowers hiding amid all the leaves. Perhaps he should pretend his business here was herbs, and not mention Viator at all. He'd been meaning to stock up on a few things anyway, and here was the ideal opportunity. He raised a hand and knocked on the door. When he received no answer, he pushed the door open and stuck his head inside. "Hello, is the healer home?" He waited a moment, then stepped into the house. "No, but I am," said a young feminine voice. Zoticus blinked. A girl stood on the other side of a counter, her hands on her hips. No longer a child, but not quite a woman either. Likely Viator's niece, if he was not mistaken. He bowed. "My pardon, mistress. Perhaps you could tell me where I might find the healer?" She smiled, an enchanting sight that likely would have half the male population of this town swooning at her feet. "Well now, seeing as you mean me no harm, perhaps I can help you. I know as much as my mother when it comes to healing, maybe more depending on your ailment." She looked him up and down as if searching for sickness. Perhaps she was. He could sense the magic in her blood, though he wasn't sure what shape her gift took. A vision hit him of this girl flapping her arms and crying out, before transforming into a swan. He blinked, and he was back in the cottage again. "If it is the falling sickness you suffer from, sir, then I recommend rue. I have some fresh leaves from which you can make an infusion, or you can buy it powdered for tea, but you might prefer a vial of oil of rue, which is easier to use for a traveler like yourself. I've made a fresh batch just this week in preparation for autumn coughs and colds, but it is good for the falling sickness too. Just a drop in the morning after you break your fast." She'd seen him freeze as the vision took him, and mistaken it for illness instead of magic. What she did not know was that rue only intensified the visions. Then another thought struck him. "How do you know I mean you no harm?" he demanded. She smiled again. "Because if you did, the enchantment on the door would have turned you into a frog." So her mother's threat to Viator hadn't been an empty one. Your mother can transform people into animals? He'd heard of a family line in the mountains who passed such a gift down the generations. Perhaps Tola was descended from them. The girl's face twisted. "When she was a girl, yes, but my father tried to beat the magic out of her, so now her magic is not as strong as it was. The door enchantment will only make you believe you are a frog, and you'll behave like one for a day or two, before returning to normal. That's how she escaped my father. She made him think he was a fish. And he drowned in a Rialto canal." "Then I must speak to your mother. Can you tell me where I can find her, please?" The girl sighed. She took some oil of rue up to Elder Ahab's house. His daughter's always been sickly and she's ailing again. Poor Isabel. Zoticus nodded. "So I should look for the biggest, grandest house, and that's where I'll find her?" She burst out laughing. "Heavens no. Well, you might, for Mother and Sarah are great friends, but Ahab's house is behind the meeting hall beside the town green. His family has the rights to use the cottage as long as they repair the fences around the green. You should have heard him swearing when they all blew over in that spring storm a couple of years back. The girl would make a good village witch when the time came. She knew all the town gossip without revealing anything about herself. He still didn't know what her magical gifts were or even her name. "So I will find Mistress Tola at the cottage behind the meeting hall next to the town green?" he asked. "Oh, for certain. Unless she has already seen to Isabel and there is a town council meeting. In fact, I remember her saying there might be a meeting. Maybe then she'll be in the meeting hall." Zoticus shook his head. So much for certainty. Then again, in a town this small, finding anyone wouldn't be that hard. As long as they were still alive, though that seemed likely. "Thank you," he said. "You have been most helpful. Are you sure you don't want some oil of rue to take with you? You won't get it any fresher, and the price will only go up with winter on the way." The girl was a witch, but she had the blood of a Rialto merchant in her veins, of that he was certain. Almost against his will, he found himself pulling out his purse. How much? 13. We need to do more to encourage traders to come here. Now they no longer stop in Altino, traders will come up the river in search of what we can provide. The more people know about our products, the more they will want them. Instead of one trader, we should have a dozen traders, maybe more, sailing up and down the river to take our goods for sale in the markets of Rialto. Better yet, we should send invitations to all the merchants of Rialto, inviting them here for some sort of celebration, so they can see all we can offer and they can show their wares to us. Ahab's grin beamed around the hall, seeking encouragement to continue. He wanted this so much, and it sounded so promising, even Sarah wondered if maybe. She could see Tola shaking her head. Someone had to stop him, and now seemed a good moment. Perhaps after this plague outbreak is over, then we might send someone to Rialto to meet with the merchants, Sarah ventured. Someone who has all of the town's interests in mind. But now with just Mercurio, we didn't have enough trade goods to fill his new ship. He'll have to return in the autumn, when we have more to sell. With the news of plague in Altino and maybe other places too, we cannot be too careful. Allowing new people into the town now may bring the pestilence here. And who is better equipped to deal with sickness than a healthful place like Miroton? Why, we have more healing herbs here than anywhere else in the world, I'm certain of it. Why else would Mercurio buy so much from us? We are good pious people, not steeped in sin like some port full of sailors and unspeakable things. God would never visit a plague on us. Oh, by all that was holy, when he started invoking religion, she had no hope of swaying anyone to her side. She'd learned that lesson last meeting. But she had to try. They could not risk. Actually, the lady is right. The plague took every soul in Altino, saint and sinner alike. And every town along the river between here and the lagoon. This wasn't God's doing. This was a trader, selling tainted goods to those towns. You're lucky he never reached you, or your people would be dying too. Sarah stared at owner of the voice. He strode into the hall like he owned it, muscles bulging as he folded his arms across his fine linen tunic. A Rialto merchant maybe, or some neighboring lord. A handsome stranger she needed to know more about. And who are you? Ahab asked, bristling like an alarmed hedgehog. The stranger delivered a courtly bow so practiced, Sarah was certain he'd spent time in a royal court. I am Master Zoticus, and I have come to save your town from the plague. No title. Not a prince or a lord or a baron or even a knight. Master Zoticus, indeed. Sarah smelled a rat. At what cost, Master Zoticus? What price must we pay for your services? He bowed deeper still. I would do it simply for the pleasure of serving you, my lady. Ahab spluttered incoherently. Anyone who could render Ahab speechless and support her in keeping Miroton safe could not be all bad. For the first time that day, Sarah flashed a brilliant smile at the newcomer. She was almost embarrassed to hear her voice come out in a low purr as she said, Then, Master Zoticus, I accept. He straightened and his eyes met hers. She could not look away, and nor could he, it seemed. Perhaps she imagined the startled look in his eyes, for it was gone almost as soon as it had appeared. Then, as swiftly as he had entered the hall, he turned on his heel and was gone. 14. The woman in his vision. The sight of her had unnerved him for a moment, but Zoticus was certain no one had noticed. She hadn't appeared the slightest bit perturbed, let alone panicked, and on this warm summer evening she wore no cloak. Her voice had been delightfully warm too. He stopped that thought before it blossomed into something far more troublesome. He'd met many beautiful women, and he'd never let his lust for them get in the way of getting a job done. Currently, she was his client, which made his attraction to her even easier to ignore. Because if he didn't complete this quest, she might die of the plague. But not before he'd seen the panic in her eyes as her mourning cloak flew behind her. Which meant someone close to her would die, as she wasn't wearing mourning now. He had to concentrate on his mission, not some mystery woman. He found the town's only inn, and the innkeeper allowed him to rent a room if you promise not to tell Mistress Sarah. She was most particular about not having strangers to stay. In a town this small, Mistress Sarah and anyone else who cared would know he was staying in the inn within a day, but Zoticus merely smiled and gave the woman his word. The room was larger than the one in Altino, and a lot cleaner too. This wasn't a town that saw too many visitors, and right now he was the sole guest at the inn, which suited him fine. He paid extra to have his supper brought up to him, instead of joining the townsfolk in the taproom. Their curiosity about him would not save them from the plague. Only when the maid had taken away his empty supper dish, did he start his preparations. First he bolted the door. Next he extracted a magical candle from his pouch, lit it, and set it on the table. Then he stretched out on the bed and closed his eyes. Most magic folk were better at this than him. His mother could do it in a few blinks without anyone being the wiser, though when she really wanted a deep draught of knowledge, she settled in her chair beside the fire. His sister, Zoraida, powerful enchantress though she was, could not touch the vast store of ancestral magic memory that dwelt in her blood. It irritated her no end that a weak enchanter like him could access the knowledge he could barely use. He tried to explain it to her, that it was much the same as dipping into his magic pouch and willing what he wanted to appear in his hand, but Zoraida would have none of it. Which was probably why she fought dragons and he was here in this tiny mountain town, chasing visions and rumors and hoping he could save them. But tonight he sought memories of plagues past, how they started and how they were stopped. He took a deep breath and let the memories flow. Rats. Fleas. Floods. People dressed in clothing the like of which he'd never seen before. Likely long dead. Boils. Coughing. Something small enough to swim through the blood, like magic itself, but nowhere near as benign. And the dead, still carrying the sickness, so even the grave diggers were not safe. Bodies were best burned. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes. Millennia of memories marched past his eyes, the sight seen by thousands of magic users. Yet when Zoticus surfaced, he knew one thing for certain: there was no cure for the plague. No herb or potion could touch it. A powerful healing spell might help, but healing was a power granted to few, and the touch of a spell so strong would leave its mark on the patient forever. So he could not cure it. But he could stop it from spreading, if he could banish every rat and flea from the town. A Herculean task, if ever there was one. But for an assassin who'd slain 4 heavily armed knights before their own armies, it would surely be a simple matter. The vermin stood no chance against him, and nor would the rats and fleas either. 15. Sylvana brought the wagon piled high with sacks, a grim look on her face. "Where is your father?" Sarah asked. "Probably in the inn, asleep on the floor. He's barely been home for days. If I didn't know how to work the mill, none of this would be ground." Sylvana sighed. "I keep hoping he'll wake up and see there is still a world without Mother in it, but I'm not sure he even cares about me anymore." "He cares. I'm sure he cares. He just loved your mother so much." Sarah pulled the girl into a hug. They stood there for what felt like a long time, yet Sarah felt no need to break the embrace before Sylvana was ready. Eventually Sylvana pulled away, ducking her head as she sniffled. "I'm sorry. I just miss her so much, and he." Sarah smiled awkwardly. "I lost my parents within days of one another, when I was not much older than you. My brothers too. I know it isn't easy, but it's not easy for your father either. When my husband died, I swear part of me died with him. If I hadn't had Tobias to care for, I might have lost myself in grief too. Women are stronger than men will ever be, I fear. Not because we want to be, but because we must be. Without us the world will fall apart. So we shed a few tears when it all becomes too much, but we go back to work when men would rather drink their way to the bottom of a barrel. That's not what the stories say. They're full of big strong heroes who save helpless maidens from monsters, Sylvana grumbled. Sarah laughed. Of course they are. We all have our fantasies, do we not? Women wish men were stronger and more capable, so they won't need to do everything themselves, and men dream of being in charge, having women begging for their help instead of calling them fools for their latest blunder. Most men would not last a week without a woman to tell him what to do, and see that he has food. You're putting me off ever wanting to get married then. Well, there are benefits of having a man around. They tend to chop the wood for you and carry heavy things and do some of the work around the farm. Sarah winked. And in bed at night, a good husband is never too tired to make his wife happy. Sylvana's eyes grew wide with horror. But that means babies. Noisy, helpless things that need more care than grown men. But babies only happen once every 9 months, and usually longer than that. Besides, you may change your mind when you hold your own child in your arms. Maybe. Sylvana eyed the cart. Do you want me to unload these? Sarah considered, then shook her head. No, let's put the cart away in the barn, and I'll find some laborers to do the heavy lifting. A day or two will not harm the flour, it'll be sitting in the cellar for months. It took 2 of them to get the ponies to pull the cart into the barn, before turning them loose in Sarah's field to snack on the stubble left over from the summer haymaking. Come inside for a cup of cider. I keep it cool in the cellar, Sarah said, leading the way into the house while Sylvana followed. What is that awful noise? Sylvana asked. Deep in the cellar, Sarah could not hear anything. She ascended the steps, listening hard. Finally, Sarah said, it sounds like the time when Tobias found my grandfather's flute, and tried to play it like the traveling minstrels he'd seen in the town square. Terrible screeching. When he was asleep that night, I made sure to hide the flute where he might never find it again. But he should still be up in the high pasture. Now it was her turn to follow Sylvana out the front door and down the road into town. A crowd of townspeople lined the roadside, transfixed by the bizarre parade headed their way. The screeching music did indeed come from a flute, played by a figure in a brightly striped cloak that flew about him as he twirled and capered down the road. Behind him, a river of brown, black and white followed. Those by the roadside recoiled as the piper passed, pressing their backs to walls and fences in an effort to get away from him, though they could not stop staring. At first, Sarah thought it was the music that repelled them, until the river came close enough for Sylvana to see what formed the flow. It's rats. A whole plague of rats. Thousands of them following him, she said. They horrified her even more than babies, judging by her expression. The piper drew even with Sarah, and he stopped to offer her a courtly bow. Master Zoticus, she exclaimed. What in heaven's name are you doing with all those rats? He straightened and grinned at her. Why, saving your town from pestilence, my lady. Ridding it of all the rats. Another bow, and he resumed playing the flute. There was a tune to it of sorts, but it wasn't something one would want to dance to. Master Zoticus was no minstrel, that was for sure. He was a rat catcher. Your Pied Piper is mad, said a new voice. Ahab, of course. This time, Sarah was inclined to agree with him. She'd never seen a man charm rats before. Why would anyone want to? Yet Zoticus seemed too sure of himself to be mad. Little though she liked rats, she wanted to follow him to see where he took them. No, that would be foolish. She'd have a better view from her work table behind the house. And she'd avoid the rats. She watched Zoticus take his river of rats down to the lake, where he boarded a boat, with Matteo at the oars no less, and headed out over the water. The rats followed him blindly, jumping off the dock and into the lake. They swam for a bit until they went under and did not surface. Hundreds of them at a time. Sarah shuddered. There had to be 200 rats for every man, woman and child in Miroton. Had there really been so many? Or had Zoticus brought them here? When all the rats had disappeared, Matteo turned the boat around, and Zoticus took an oar to help the old man row back to shore. He'd thrown his striped cloak off, and Sarah couldn't help but stare as the muscles in his arms rippled at every stroke. He was well fed for a rat catcher, and likely as strong as any man in Miroton. He stepped from the boat to the dock with the grace of a practiced sailor, too. And then he shaded his eyes from the sun and peered up the hill to where she stood staring. He directed another deep bow in her direction, and Sarah felt her cheeks redden. "Now there's a man who thinks a lot of himself," Tola said. Sarah started. She'd been so busy watching Zoticus, she hadn't even noticed her friend's arrival. "I bet he's terrible in bed," Tola added. Sarah sighed. Such men usually were. "But it doesn't hurt to dream," she said. "He'll have half the girls in town dreaming about him tonight, not just you." Sarah shrugged. "As long as I have him to myself in the dream, they may do what they like." "There's magic about him," Swanhild said. "He's still susceptible to her spell, but I think he knew she'd cast it. She said he came looking for me at first, but it seems he found you and liked you better. He hasn't said a word to me." There was a strange twisting sensation in Sarah's belly, and she wasn't sure if it was good or bad. "Have you come to warn me to be careful?" Tola snorted. "He didn't set off my door enchantment, and Swanhild said he was well-spoken and polite. I don't believe he means harm to anyone in Miroton. Maybe I'm wrong and he'd be delightful in bed. Most men with magic in their blood learn to respect the women in their family, for it must run strong in the female line for it to show up in the boys." Swanhild did say he asked for directions. "Most unusual in a man." "So you think I should seduce him?" Sarah asked. "Oh no. I think you should consider allowing him to seduce you. And if you do allow him to share your bed, promise to tell me about it." They both laughed, but they also watched Zoticus stride up the road back into town. Sarah wet her lips. Perhaps she would. 16. Zoticus might not be able to read minds, but he'd known what the woman from his vision was thinking while she watched him today. And while his vision of her wasn't about to happen today, he was pretty sure he knew he'd see her again soon, that very evening if he wasn't mistaken. He told himself the rats and fleas were the reason he'd bathed and changed into clean clothes, while leaving today's things to be laundered by the inn's maid. He debated whether to go down to the tap room for dinner, where she might easily find him, but she seemed the sort of lady who would wish to see him privately, and the inn staff would honor her wishes. So he ate dinner alone in his room, then stretched out on the bed. Whether she arrived early or late, she'd probably appreciate it, if he was well rested for whatever she had in mind. And he'd enjoy it more if he wasn't tired. He slipped easily into dreams of her, and was woken by a tap at the door. "Yes," he said. "There's someone to see you, Master Zoticus," the maid said. There was a quaver in her voice that hadn't been there before. It would not do to greet her from his bed. Too presumptuous. He hadn't bothered to undress, so it took him a moment to pull on some boots before he answered, "You can come in." He placed himself by the table where he'd left a jug of wine and 2 cups. The inn's best wine, he'd been told, and he'd tasted enough to know it was at least drinkable. Then the door creaked open and 2 men crowded inside. Rough laborers by the look of them, used to hard work and heavy lifting. Men who could not afford an assassin and who would never be targeted by one, because commoners like them were not above the law, especially when noblemen were the ones who enforced it. But they were smart enough to fear him. "Master Zoticus, you are summoned to a meeting at the town hall," one of them said. "By whom?" "By all that was holy." He wanted to know the name of the woman in his vision. Then again, if she was the sort to summon him to her bed, he wasn't sure if she was worth the trouble. The two men eyed each other nervously, as if daring the other man to say her name first. Finally the one who'd already spoken said, "By Elder Ahab, head of the town council." Zoticus did his best to hide his surprise. The head of the council had seemed more like a useless pufferfish than any real kind of authority, but this man wasn't lying. So either this Ahab had summoned him, or the woman had told these two the summons was at Ahab's order, and they'd believed her. He relaxed. Yes, that seemed more likely. Zoticus swept a light cloak about his shoulders. "What are we waiting for, then? To the town hall we must go." The men breathed twin sighs of relief as they accompanied him out of the inn. Zoticus glimpsed the maid's wide eyes watching from a darkened doorway before she hid her face. Why did they all fear him when this morning they hadn't cared about how much they stared at him? It couldn't have been the rats, or his skill with the high-pitched enchanted flute his mother had given him. The instrument's shrill whistle was enough to melt earwax, even before she'd enchanted it to summon any creature he cared to name. Idly, he wondered if it would work on dragons. Zoticus shook his head. Something to consider later, when he had someone more experienced in fighting dragons by his side. To his surprise, the sun was already peeping over the horizon. He'd slept longer than he'd thought. Why the lady would want to see him so early in the day, but this was a farming town, not a trading city like Rialto. Days went from dawn until dusk in places like this, and perhaps she'd fallen into the same pattern. Zoticus stepped into the town hall, where a lone candle cast more shadows than light. "Bring him here." The voice did not belong to a woman. Zoticus peered into the darkness, waiting for his eyes to adjust. There was the man who'd spoken. Ahab sat just outside the candle's pool of light, with a cup in one hand and a jug by his elbow. Judging by his sloppy movements, he'd been drinking a while. Most of the night, if Zoticus was any judge. "You assassin! You brought this evil to my town," he slurred. For a moment, it felt like someone's cold hand squeezed his heart inside his chest. But Zoticus's head was quicker than his heart. He couldn't have brought the plague here. Every rat and flea in the town now lay dead and drowned at the bottom of the lake. He'd arrived in town with only the contents of his magical pouch, and nothing he placed in that pouch survived the enchantment. He'd left a piece of ham in the pocket of his summer cloak when he'd stashed it away, and pulled the same piece out, more than a year later, as fresh as the day it had been sliced. But this wasn't about ham. It wasn't about him, either. What evil might that be? Zoticus asked. You're evil. We're good people. We work hard, go to church, pray and live virtuous lives, but you kill for money. Is it not written in God's commandments that we must not kill? And it also says in the Bible that men shouldn't wear both linen and wool, and women shouldn't cook meat with milk, Zoticus replied. He'd read the entire tome, had an illuminated copy in his pouch somewhere actually, and it made his ancestral memories seem positively orderly in comparison. Not that he'd say that to the Pope who'd given him the enormous book. And the whole book is full of people killing each other for all manner of crimes, not just mixing linen and wool or meat and milk. Do not lie to me. Are you not Master Zoticus the assassin, who has slayed countless men the world over, enough to fill a river with their blood? Ahab demanded. I am Master Zoticus and I keep count, Zoticus snapped. Of the men I have killed and of their victims. A river? If they had lived, they could have filled an ocean with the blood and tears of their victims and the families who mourn them, but those victims and their families have justice now because of me. And what of my daughter? Why did you kill her? What crime can sweet Isabel have committed, that you saw fit to kill her? How much did they pay you? Ahab's eyes were wild now with a madness Zoticus recognized, though too late. A grieving father would do anything to revenge a favorite child. Zoticus shook his head, lifting his hands up in surrender. I never met your daughter. I cannot have killed her. You are mistaken. Someone else must have done this terrible deed. Perhaps I can help you. Ahab pointed a shaking finger at him. You have done enough. It was you and no one else with your evil that has brought this plague upon us. Upon her, the sweetest girl who ever lived. Horror seized Zoticus's tongue, rendering him speechless. Even if he could have spoken, he had no words. He was wrong. The plague had touched this town and he was too late to save them. He had to warn the woman in his vision. He turned to leave, but a glancing blow struck his head, and everything went white for a moment. A second blow turned it all black. 17. Sarah found her mind drifting in church that morning. Perhaps it was because Zoticus had been in her dreams so much the night before, she'd woken several times, convinced he was in her bedchamber. Of course he hadn't been, but getting back to sleep hadn't been easy. Or perhaps it was because Father Fazio kept droning on and on about how they had to reject evil and protect their virtue, as he'd been doing every day since they'd heard about the plague in Altino. It made her wonder if Fazio thought the town was a flock of white-clad virgins, the sort who'd never done anything in their lives, let alone commit a single sin. She suppressed a snort. No one in the town over the age of 3 could possibly be without sin. And there was the whole concept of original sin, that they'd all inherited from Adam and Eve, or so Father Fazio had told them back in May, when some of the teenagers in town had tried to celebrate some pagan fertility rite. Actually, she remembered trying something similar with Tobias's father when they'd been that age. Of course, they'd gone up to the high pasture instead of into the forest, so no one had interrupted their private celebration. One they'd repeated every year until Tobias was born. Come to think of it, Tobias might have been conceived up there in the high pasture. Perhaps the old fertility rites still had power. And we will be conducting a prayer vigil for Isabel this evening. All are invited to attend, Fazio finished. Wait, Isabel? When the mass ended, she kept her eyes on Ahab, hoping to catch him before he left. He hurried out of the church, and she could barely keep him in sight as he strode off toward the town green. He reached the door of his cottage, and for a moment he hesitated with his hand on the door handle. Ahab, is she all right? Sarah called as she approached. Ahab slowly turned to face her, and he didn't need to open his mouth to answer her. She pressed her hand to her mouth. Oh no. How bad is she? Is there anything I can do? A harsh laugh came out of his throat, unlike any noise she'd ever heard him make before. Oh, you've already done enough. Instead of driving the evil out of town like any sensible person should have, you let him stay. And he killed her. That vile wretch killed my Isabel. His words made no sense. Someone killed Isabel? You mean, she wasn't ill? Before he came she was fine. She filled all the mattresses on her own, she insisted upon it. But the night he came, she fell ill. Deathly ill. So suddenly it seemed like a curse, something only the most evil wretch could have possibly cast upon her. He had all of the town fawning over him, watching that spectacle yesterday, while his curse stole her life away. That assassin killed my daughter, and I will have justice. Ahab, she began. The death of his daughter had evidently driven the man mad. What assassin? Your Pied Piper, the capering fool I saw you making sheep's eyes at yesterday, Ahab spat. The man you allowed into our town, who you welcomed into your service, is none other than Master Assassin Zoticus, a demon who has slain more men than the very devil himself. The bishop himself sent warning to Father Fazio only yesterday that the assassin might be headed our way, and should he arrive here, we should send him straight to the bishop to face justice for his crimes. Alas, the warning arrived too late for Isabel. It begged belief. But why would anyone want Isabel dead? She was perhaps the only person in town who might have fitted Father Fazio's image of an innocent virgin, for heaven knew the girl had rarely been well enough to spend time with boys her own age. You'd have to ask that demon, that wolf in sheep's clothing, but I beg you do not. Stay away from him, lest he kill you too. He's already charmed you like the devil he is, and with his every breath, he expels more pestilence. Save yourself and stay away. I've had him locked away, where he cannot harm anyone else in the town, and I will send someone to fetch some of the bishop's men, for it will take a heavy guard to escort a demon to Rialto. Amid all the madness, one thing became clear. Isabel died of the plague? The plague has come to Miroton? Sarah asked. She didn't want to believe it. Carried by that demon of an assassin, Master Zoticus himself. Ahab yanked open his door, strode into his cottage, then slammed the door in her face. If the plague had indeed come to Miroton. Heaven help us all, Sarah whispered. 18. Zoticus woke to the sound of something grinding above him. That placed him in the cellar beneath the mill most likely. He reached for the back of his head and found his hair sticky with dried blood, but his healing amulet had taken care of the wound and the headache he probably would have woken with without magical assistance. He'd worn the amulet around his neck since leaving Rialto. One couldn't be too careful with plague about. Enough daylight reached the cellar that he knew it was likely the middle of the day outside, and not a good time to escape, if he didn't want to be seen. The town would see enough death with the plague, they didn't need anyone dying at his hands when he escaped. It was best for everybody if he waited until night. In the meantime, he was at leisure to explore his cell. They'd laid him on a well-stuffed straw pallet, with a blanket that could have been the twin of the one he'd slept under in the inn. A jug of water sat on the floor beside him, along with a basket of food that would feed a family for an entire day. Bread, cheese, apples, and a chunk of meat he suspected had come from a goat. Drink first, then something to eat. He uncorked the jug and breathed deeply. That definitely wasn't water. Strong cider, if he wasn't mistaken. He wasn't sure if his jailers wanted him drunk and easier to deal with, or whether this was normal prisoner fare for Miroton. If they treated prisoners so well, it was a surprise they didn't have more of them. Perhaps he should stay for a few days, until the plague ended their hospitality. He could do with a rest, and the cider would certainly help him with that. But he still had to warn the woman in his vision. Zoticus sighed. Tonight then. After he'd demolished the dinner they'd provided. 19. It felt surreal returning to the church that evening for Isabel's vigil. The whole town was there, heads bowed in grief for a girl none of them would have said was deserving of death. Did you hear about the assassin? Sarah lifted her head to find Silvana at her elbow. I heard something, yes. A little from Ahab, more from Fazio, and a great deal from Tola, for the man had quite the reputation in Rialto. Elder Ahab had him locked in father's cellar. He means to keep him there for some days. Elder Ahab said he killed Isabel. Is it true? Sarah lowered her voice. Elder Ahab is mad with grief. He is likely to say many things both true and untrue. I myself have heard him say Master Zoticus killed Isabel, yet in the next breath he swore she died of the plague. I'm not sure what I fear most, whether Ahab has accused an innocent man of murder, or whether he has imprisoned an assassin so deadly he will surely exact vengeance on the whole town. Even if he is an assassin, why Isabel? If someone wanted these lands so badly, surely their assassin would choose a more suitable target. Her voice died. Tobias. If anyone wanted her family's lands, they'd have to kill Tobias. She had to know. Go in without me. I'll catch up, Sarah said, gesturing for Sylvana to enter the candle-lit church. The summer night seemed colder than it should, but she let the darkness cloak her as she hurried away. If she wanted to speak to Zoticus alone, now would be the best time, with everyone at the church. To ask him if he really was an assassin, and whether Tobias was in danger. And if so, to do whatever it took to save Tobias. Because Ahab had loved Isabel, but it was nothing compared to the fierce love Sarah harbored for her only son. As long as she drew breath, she would do everything within her power to save him. From assassins, from the plague, and anything else that threatened him. Heaven help the man who stood in her way. She marched down to the silent mill. The cellar had a set of double doors, wide enough to allow a wagon inside, barred with an enormous beam that usually took 2 men to lift. Yet when she raised her lantern high to look for something that might allow her to lever it open, she found the beam on the floor and the doors open wide. Inside the cellar itself was an empty pallet, and no sign of the man except for the faint outline where he'd lay before he'd left. Sarah snorted softly. It seemed heaven had already helped Master Zoticus. Heaven or the devil. Whoever had helped him, it mattered not. He had to be headed out of town, and there was only one road. If she followed it, she'd soon catch up to him. He wouldn't escape her so easily. 20. Finally, the sun called it a day. Zoticus stretched, pocketed the last of the bread and cheese, and dug out his lock-picking charm. All right, it was actually a key, but he had yet to find the lock it had been made for. The enchantment allowed it to work without being inserted into a lock, though he did still have to pay a blood price, like with any magic. Tonight, the door seemed to be particularly stubborn. A drop or 2 of blood was usually enough, but this time it wasn't until the key was coated in his blood and threatening to slip out of his fingers that the doors finally opened. The people of Miroton really wanted him to stay, didn't they? He stepped over the beam that had once barred the doors and headed up to the road. No one was about, though there were lights further up the hill, around the church. Some local saint's day perhaps, or some other holy day he'd forgotten. He wasn't even sure what day it was anymore, let alone the date. The church would have to forgive his absence. The people of Miroton certainly wouldn't welcome him. So he followed the road the other way, away from the town. Lake water lapped softly at the dock, reminding him he could borrow a boat and follow the river all the way to the Rialto Lagoon. The boat's owner would likely be dead of plague within weeks, so he wouldn't even miss it. Tempting, but his instincts told him no. Instead, he stayed on the road just long enough to be well away from Miroton, before he set up camp. As the town fell behind him so only moonlight lit his way, Zoticus became aware of a second set of footsteps following him. He paused. When the footsteps continued, he ghosted into the trees. Godfrey had never understood this was why Zoticus always wore grey. A man didn't need magic to become invisible. Soon enough, a figure approached. A lantern hanging from their hand illuminated the road around the figure's boots, and little more. Now it was Zoticus's turn to do the following, but his footfalls were silent and swift. The first the figure knew of his presence was the knife he pressed to her throat. For with his free arm around her body, he was left in no doubt that she was a woman. One who was too scared to scream or struggle. "Why are you following me?" he hissed in her ear. "First, to find out if you really are an assassin, but I suppose I already have my answer to that," she said. The woman from his vision. Her heart beat fast beneath his hand, but there was no fear in her tone. He relaxed, but didn't yet lower the blade. "The second was to return your things, which you left in the inn." Zoticus cursed inwardly. He wasn't normally this careless, but he could afford to replace all of the commonplace items he'd left in the inn. "And third, I have a commission I wish you to undertake." Every word was the truth. He released her and tucked his knife back into his belt. I choose which commissions I take. So I have heard. You don't kill anyone except those you are commissioned to kill, and even then, no one is entirely sure you are responsible. Even holy crusaders at the head of an army. She had a source of information who was unusually well informed. Better than Ahab or the other townsfolk. If he had to guess, he'd pick Mistress Tola, the witch from Rialto? Yes. How did Isabel die? His throat grew tight. I wasn't there, so I don't know. Her father said it was the plague. If the man was correct, he didn't have the heart to tell her that everyone she knew would die. Ah, but she already knew. If the plague has come to Miroton, then my people will suffer the same fate as everyone in Altino. Her shoulders slumped. Not everyone. I survived. The moment the words left his lips, he regretted them. No matter what the monk said, he could not work miracles, and that's what it would take to save Miroton if ridding it of rats and fleas was not enough. How? Magic and luck. Luck that I survived the plague once before, coming home from a crusade. And magic which won't work on anyone but me. He set off down the road again, not caring if she followed. Of course she did. Where are you going? She called. To make camp far enough away from your town so I can sleep. I know the best spots for travelers to camp between towns. I'll show you. He could probably find them on his own, but he did not refuse her offer. Something told him he needed to hear more about the job she wished to offer him. He let the silence swell between them, wondering if she would break it with chatter. Most people could not abide silence for long. This lady was not most people. He smiled in the dark. What's funny? She asked. A thought came to him and he ran with it. What would your husband say if he could see you now, following some assassin you barely know down the road, away from your home? He expected her to stop and blush, or come to her senses and turn back. Instead, her voice was cold as her steps never slowed. It might surprise you to learn that the lands of Miroton are quite extensive, so in truth, I have not yet left home. Besides, I imagine my husband is far too busy doing important things instead of watching what's going on down here. But if he were watching over me, I imagine he'd approve of my willingness to do what I must for those I care about. Now he was the one who hung his head in shame. You are a widow. I'm sorry for your loss. He refused to focus on the spark of hope that leaped into life at the thought of her having no husband. As am I, but I still have my son. He'll be a man soon, old enough to claim his birthright. There was a bitter note in her voice, but it seemed that the bitterness was directed at him, not the son. There's the camp one use when I trade with the other towns. She lifted her lantern and pointed. The clearing held little more than a fire pit ringed around with stones, and a small pile of firewood left by some kindly traveler. Or the lady herself? No, surely one of her servants. She made no effort to help him as he set up some kindling and set it alight. Soon he had a small fire going. Without rising from his knees, he held out his hand to the still-standing woman. My things, please? Wordlessly, she handed him his traveling sack, which felt heavier than he remembered it. Perhaps because she'd packed his freshly laundered clothes, a flagon of wine and other provisions. Miroton might not be the friendliest town, but at least they were generous with their hospitality. The least he could do was share what little hospitality he had here. He spread the striped cloak on the ground for her and set the wine flagon between them. Now please sit, my lady, and tell me about this commission you have in mind. She set the lantern down beside the cloak. Sarah. Her name. His lady finally had a name. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this jubilant. If it please my lady Sara, will you sit and share a cup of wine with me while you tell me what you desire? He didn't mean it to come out so seductive. He just She laughed. She laughed so hard she fell to her knees and rolled onto her side on the striped cloak. It's Sara. Just Sara. And Tola was right. No, he would not fall into this trap. There was a reason few assassins lived as long as he had. You live in the grandest house in Miroton, and the town and all the land surrounding it belongs to your family, does it not? She nodded once. So much land would not be granted to anyone less than a knight. So your husband? She laughed harder. My husband was a goat herder and a good man. He had a silver tongue and a sweet smile, but he never held a sword in his life, nor did he need to. So the land was hers. What of your father? She sobered. My father was a good man. He took his place on the town council, and he was so busy running the estate he had no time for swordplay or horses that weren't for working. My brothers, had they lived, some of them hoped to be trained as knights. Much like my grandfather and his father, whose swords are still mounted on a wall in the house somewhere. I think it was my great-grandfather who was a Crusader knight. The king gave him the estate to honor his service in the Holy Land. That must have been the very first crusade, a more honorable affair than the one Zoticus had joined. Though he'd seen tavern brawls more honorable if truth be told, so that wasn't saying much. Which would make him a baron and you, Lady Sara, liege lord to everyone who lives here. Slowly, she shook her head. No. Their liege lord will be Tobias, my son. She lifted her gaze to meet his eyes. Enough banter. From what I have seen and what I have heard, you are a man of honor and honesty. If I ask you a question, will you tell me the truth? I will not lie. She inclined her head. That is fair. Now tell me, did you come to Miroton to kill my son? Why would she think that? Had someone threatened her in the past? Surely they'd have wanted both her and the son dead, for the lands were hers. She mistook his silence for something else. If you have come to kill him, I will pay you double to stay your hand. He should have told her the truth instantly instead of weighing her words. Now he'd sound like he was lying. Triple. What could he say? Triple of nothing was still nothing. He didn't kill children. She leaned forward, her eyes glittering in the firelight. Name your price. If it is within my power to grant it to you, I will give you whatever you want, if you will swear to save my son. All he wanted right now was her. Perhaps it was the cider he'd been drinking all day, or some intoxicating scent she wore, or the spell she wove with words alone. He no longer cared why. He kissed her. 21. May God forgive her, but once his lips touched hers, Sara forgot she'd ever had a son. She was aware of nothing but that moment. The tart taste of cider on his tongue, his warm breath mingling with hers, his fingers tracing her jaw as one kiss became all the seduction she could ever need to succumb. Until it stopped. Zoticus froze, and it was like kissing a corpse. Farewelling a love she'd known but briefly, which would never be enough. She moved away from him, putting a more decorous distance between them. For a moment she'd been willing to give him all of herself, but he'd declined. Good. One of them should be sensible when business dealings and lives hung in the balance. Finally, he moved. The castle in the mountains, he said, or something like it, before shaking his head. It's not a castle. It's a monastery. The cloister of the Holy Innocents, built by the king to house the relics my ancestor brought back from his crusade. The remains of the Holy Innocents, Sara said. Zoticus drew in a sharp breath. Have you been there? She let out a laugh. In case you haven't noticed, I'm a woman. Women aren't welcome in monasteries. Apparently we distract the men from their work. Men who are easily distracted must not be very good at their jobs. Unlike him. She sighed. Perhaps. I don't imagine I'd be much of a distraction now. Perhaps they might allow me to visit. But first you wish me to save your son. She eyed him across the fire. First, I wish to hear you swear you will not kill my son. Then, I want you to save him. If someone sent you to kill him, what will stop them from sending another? She reached for the pouch at her belt, untied it, and tossed the pouch into his lap. He lifted it, shaking it so the coins inside tinkled sweetly. What is this for? That is for ridding us of rats. I have no desire to be indebted to you. Now what will it cost me for you to save my son? He gazed at her through the flames. He looked so long, she feared he was reading her soul. Finally he said, Lady Sarah, the only payment I ask is the honor of serving you. She wanted to believe him. Truly she did. But he was an assassin sent to kill her son. Though he talked of honor, she still didn't know what that meant to an assassin. Perhaps he had honor. Or maybe he had none. She wrapped the striped cloak around her and leaned back against the tree behind her. Then we should get some sleep, so that on the morrow we can head back to Miroton for my son. You would sleep alone in the forest with an assassin you barely know? You're braver than most men I have known, Lady Sarah. Better than sharing his bed, she thought to herself as she felt her face heat. Now that would be foolish. No, Master Zoticus. I intend to spend the night keeping watch while you sleep, so that you do not sneak away. We have a bargain, you and I. You desire honor, and I want you to save my son. Come morning, I intend to see both our wishes granted. If you truly knew my wishes and desires, you would hurry back to your own bed in Miroton tonight, my lady. His words made her spine shiver, but she refused to let him see the effect he had on her. He was handsome enough to consider making him her lover, but she'd be the one to bury a blade in his breast if he so much as shed a drop of Tobias's blood. You're on my family's land, assassin. Whether we are in Miroton or in the monastery on the mountain or here in my camp, my power is the same. Even she heard the cold, naked threat in her voice, a tone she'd never used before. She suspected even Ahab would quail if he'd heard it. Zoticus the wretch merely grinned. Lady Sarah, I suspect your power is greater than you know. I am of course yours to command. Sleep, you say? Then I shall. He stretched out, rolling himself up in his own cloak, before resting his head on his sack of belongings. Within moments, he began to snore.